When 12-year-old Freya Olsen stepped forward at her grandfather's military funeral and asked to fold the ceremonial flag, the honor guard exchanged uncomfortable glances. What happened next would leave a chapel full of hardened veterans speechless and force an entire military tradition to reconsider what they thought they knew about precision, respect, and the true meaning of honor. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Erik's Chapel in Bergen, Norway. Casting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rainbow patterns across the wooden pews filled with mourners. 12-year-old Freya Olsen sat in the front row, her small hands folded precisely in her lap, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat braid that her mother had insisted upon. She wore her only black dress, the one that was already getting too short for her growing frame, and shoes that pinched her feet because they were her sister's hand-me-downs out around her. The adult world moved with the somber efficiency that she'd grown accustomed to over the past week. Aunts and uncles she barely knew whispered condolences to her mother, their words floating over Freya's head like background noise. Her father stood rigid beside the casket, accepting handshakes and murmured sympathies with the same stoic expression he'd worn since the phone call came. Freya's eyes remained fixed on the Norwegian flag draped over her grandfather's casket. The red, white, and blue fabric lay perfectly smooth, its edges crisp and symmetrical. To everyone else in the chapel, it was simply a ceremonial covering, a symbol of Captain Henrik Olsen's 40 years of military service. But to Freya, it represented something far more personal and profound. She had spent countless afternoons in her grandfather's study, watching him demonstrate the precise art of flag folding. Precision is respect, lille venn, he would tell her in his gentle voice, using the Norwegian term of endearment, little friend. His weathered hands would move with practiced grace, each fold deliberate and meaningful. Every crease must be exact. Every movement must honor what this flag represents. Other adults had dismissed these sessions as an old man indulging his granddaughter's curiosity. Her parents saw it as harmless entertainment, a way for Bestefar to keep busy during his retirement. Her teachers viewed it as an unusual hobby for a young girl who should be more interested in dolls or sports. Even her older sister Astrid had rolled her eyes at Freya's obsession with what she called boring military stuff. But Freya understood something that the adults around her missed. Her grandfather wasn't just teaching her to fold fabric. He was passing down a tradition that stretched back generations, a ritual of honor that connected her to something larger than herself. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 3 years, she had practiced until her small fingers could execute each fold with the same precision as a veteran. Honor guard number. The chapel continued to fill with mourners as the service time approached. Freya recognized many faces from her grandfather's military reunions and community events. These were serious men and women who had served their country with distinction, who understood the weight of ceremony and tradition. They nodded respectfully to her family, their military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Near the back of the chapel, she spotted the members of the Bergen Military Honor Guard who would be conducting the flag ceremony. They stood at attention. In their dress uniforms, their posture impeccable, their expressions appropriately solemn. These were the soldiers tasked with folding her grandfather's flag and presenting it to her grandmother, a duty they performed with practiced efficiency at dozens of military funerals each year. Freya had watched similar ceremonies before, had seen these same guardsmen execute the flag-folding ritual with competence and respect. But she had also noticed the small imperfections that others missed, a fold that wasn't quite sharp enough, a movement that lacked a deliberate precision. Her grandfather had taught her. They performed the ceremony correctly, but not perfectly. Not the way Bestefar had shown her it should be done. As the organ began to play and the funeral service officially commenced, Freya felt a familiar weight settling in her chest. Not just the grief of losing the most important person in her young life, but the knowledge that she possessed something valuable that no one else recognized. She was 12 years old, small for her age, and easily overlooked in a room full of accomplished adults, but she could fold that flag better than anyone else in the chapel. The question was whether anyone would give her the chance to prove it. Pastor Johansson's voice echoed through the chapel as he spoke about Captain Olsen's distinguished service record. 40 years in the Royal Norwegian Navy, deployments across 3 continents, commendations for leadership and valor. The congregation listened respectfully as the pastor recounted achievements that sounded almost mythical to Freya, her gentle grandfather, who taught her to fold flags and made the best pancakes in Bergen, had been a military hero. But even as the formal tributes continued, Freya's mind wandered to the private moments that others hadn't witnessed. The Tuesday afternoons when her grandfather would spread a practice flag across his dining room table, his arthritic hands still steady as he demonstrated the proper technique. "Watch carefully, Freya," he would say, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military precision. "The flag must never touch the ground. Each fold has meaning. The final result must be a perfect triangle with only the blue field and stars visible." She remembered the first time she had successfully completed the entire 13-fold sequence without assistance. Her grandfather's eyes had misted with pride, though he'd maintained his composure. "Perfect," he had whispered, the Norwegian word carrying weight that the English equivalent couldn't match. "You understand what this means, don't you, Lille Ven? This isn't just about folding fabric. This is about honor." Around her, the adult world continued its predetermined rituals. Her uncle Magnus, himself a retired colonel, sat with military bearing 2 rows behind her. Her father's business colleagues filled an entire section, their expensive suits and watches marking them as important people in Bergen's commercial community. Her mother's book club members clustered together, dabbing at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. These were accomplished people, respected in their communities, comfortable with authority and hierarchy. They understood their roles in society and expected others to understand theirs. In their world, children attended funerals to learn about grief and respect, not to participate in sacred military ceremonies. The idea that a 12-year-old girl might possess skills that surpassed trained military personnel was simply outside their conceptual framework. Freya had learned this lesson repeatedly over the past 3 years. At family gatherings, when she would mention her flag-folding practice, the adults would smile indulgently and change the subject to more appropriate topics. At school, when she had given a presentation about military traditions, her classmates had seemed more interested in her grandfather's war stories than in the precise ceremonial techniques he had taught her. Even her own family struggled to understand the depth of her commitment. Her sister Astrid, now 16, interested primarily in boys and social media, had long since dismissed Freya's time with their grandfather as playing pretend soldier. Her parents, while supportive of the relationship between grandfather and granddaughter, viewed it through the lens of childhood development rather than serious skill acquisition. "It's sweet that Bestefar has found a way to connect with Freya," she had overheard her mother telling a friend. "She's always been such a serious child. At least this gives her something to focus on besides her books." The assumption was always that Freya was learning from her grandfather rather than with him, that she was receiving simplified versions of military traditions rather than mastering their full complexity. The adults around her couldn't conceive that a child might approach these sacred rituals with the same dedication and precision as a trained professional. As the service continued, Freya observed the honor guard members stationed at the rear of the chapel. She had studied their previous ceremonies, had noted the subtle variations in their technique that distinguished competent execution from perfect precision. Sergeant Larson, the team leader, was reliable but rushed his movements slightly. Corporal Anderson maintained excellent posture, but sometimes allowed the flag's edge to dip too low during transitions. Private Haugen had strong hands but occasionally gripped the fabric too tightly, creating unwanted wrinkles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These were trained soldiers, respected members of the military community, men who had earned the right to conduct flag ceremonies through years of service and dedication. Their technique was more than adequate for the solemn duty they performed, but it wasn't perfect. It wasn't what her grandfather had taught her. Freya understood that perfection in flag folding wasn't about superiority or showing off. It was about understanding that some moments in life demanded nothing less than absolute precision, that certain traditions carried weight that required perfect execution, that true respect was demonstrated through flawless technique rather than good intentions. The contrast between her knowledge and others' perceptions had never felt more acute. In 30 minutes, these well-meaning soldiers would fold her grandfather's flag with competent adequacy. Her family would receive it with appropriate gratitude. Everyone would agree that the ceremony had been conducted with proper respect and military bearing, and only Freya would know that it could have been done better, that her grandfather deserved better, that somewhere in this chapel full of adults was a 12-year-old girl who could honor his memory with the perfection he had taught her to achieve. But who would listen to a child at her grandfather's funeral? Who would trust her with something so important? The gap between what she could do and what others expected of her had never felt wider. The memory hit Freya like a wave as Pastor Johansson continued his eulogy. 3 months ago, at her school's Constitution Day celebration, she had volunteered to help with the flag ceremony. The teacher, Mrs. Haugen, had smiled that patient adult smile that Freya had come to recognize and dread. "That's very sweet of you, Freya, but we need someone stronger for this. Why don't you help with the flower arrangements instead?" The flag duty had gone to Erik Thompson, a boy 2 years older who proceeded to fumble through a sloppy fold that made Freya's teeth clench. She had arranged flowers while watching Erik create wrinkles that would have horrified her grandfather. The pattern had repeated itself countless times. At her cousin's military academy graduation last year, when she had mentioned her flag-folding knowledge to her Uncle Magnus, he had chuckled and patted her head. "Maybe when you're older, Lil Saster," he had said, using the diminutive term. That made her feel even smaller. These ceremonies require steady hands and serious responsibility. She had watched from the audience as the Academy cadets performed a flag ceremony that was technically correct, but lacked the soul her grandfather had taught her to infuse into every movement. Their folds were mechanical, efficient, but missing the reverence that transformed mere procedure into sacred ritual. Even at home, her expertise was dismissed. When her father's business partner, a retired military officer, had visited for dinner, Freya had eagerly shared what she'd learned about flag protocols. The man had listened politely before turning to her father. "Clever girl you have there, Lars. Very impressive for someone her age." The condescension stung because it was wrapped in praise. For someone her age, the qualifier that reduced her actual knowledge to cute precociousness. She wasn't taken seriously as someone who had genuinely mastered a skill. She was admired as a child who could perform adult-like behaviors. Her sister Astrid had been the most direct about it during a family argument last month. "Stop pretending you're some kind of military expert, Freya," she had snapped after Freya corrected her casual handling of their grandfather's practice flag. "You're 12. Nobody cares about your flag obsession except Bestafar, and he only encourages it because he feels sorry for you." The words had cut deeper than Astrid probably intended. Was her grandfather simply indulging her? Were those afternoon sessions just an old man's way of spending time with a granddaughter who had few friends her own age? The doubt had gnawed at her until their next Tuesday session, when her grandfather had watched her complete a perfect ceremonial fold and nodded with genuine respect. "There are soldiers with 20 years of experience who cannot do what you just did," he had told her seriously. "Don't let anyone tell you that age determines ability. Precision is precision, regardless of the hands that create it." But even her grandfather's validation couldn't shield her from the constant message that children were meant to observe, not participate. At every military event, every ceremony, every gathering where flags were involved, she was relegated to the audience. The adults performed their duties with competent adequacy while she sat with forced patience, knowing she could do better. The rejection wasn't malicious. These were good people who cared about her welfare and development. They weren't trying to hurt her feelings or stunt her growth. But their protective instincts and conventional thinking created an impenetrable barrier between her knowledge and any opportunity to demonstrate it. Children should be seen and not heard wasn't explicitly stated in Norwegian culture, but the sentiment permeated every interaction. Military ceremonies were serious business, conducted by serious people who had earned their positions through years of training and service. The idea that someone who still needed help reaching high shelves might possess skills worthy of such solemn occasions was simply incomprehensible. Now, sitting in the front pew at her grandfather's funeral, Freya felt the weight of all those rejections. Every dismissive smile, every gentle redirection, every assumption that her age disqualified her from meaningful participation. The honor guard members stood ready to perform their duty with the same competent adequacy she had witnessed countless times before, and once again, she would be expected to sit quietly and accept that good enough was sufficient for someone she loved. That her grandfather's final flag ceremony would be executed by well-meaning strangers who lacked the precision he had spent 3 years teaching her to achieve. The pastor's voice faded into background noise as Freya stared at the flag covering her grandfather's casket. Somewhere beneath that red, white, and blue fabric lay the man who had believed in her abilities when no one else would, who had seen past her age to recognize genuine skill and dedication, who had taught her that excellence was its own justification, regardless of others' expectations. In 30 minutes, that flag would be folded and presented to her grandmother. It would be done correctly, respectfully, adequately. But it wouldn't be done perfectly, and only she would know the difference. Pastor Johansson's eulogy concluded with a final prayer, and the chapel fell into the hushed transition that marked the shift from religious service to military honors. Freya watched as the honor guard members stepped forward with practiced precision, their movements synchronized through years of performing this same ceremony at countless funerals throughout Norway. Sergeant Larsen approached the casket first, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing appropriately solemn. Behind him, Corporals Anderson and Haugen took their positions at the sides of the flag-draped casket. This was the moment Freya had been dreading, the beginning of a ceremony that should have been perfect, but would settle for merely adequate. As the honor guard prepared for the flag removal, Freya noticed something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Sergeant Larsen's hands were trembling slightly, not from nervousness or lack of experience, but from something else entirely. She recognized the subtle tremor that she'd seen before in older military veterans, the early signs of a condition that affected fine motor control. Her grandfather had mentioned Sergeant Larsen during their practice sessions, speaking of him with respect as a dedicated soldier who had served with distinction. But he had also noted, with the careful observation of someone who understood the demands of precision ceremonies, that Larsen was approaching retirement age and struggling with the physical requirements of detailed flag work. Experience can compensate for many things, her grandfather had said during one of their Tuesday sessions. But some ceremonies demand absolute steadiness. There's no shame in acknowledging when age affects ability. The shame comes from letting pride override the honor due to the ceremony itself. Now, watching Sergeant Larsen approach her grandfather's casket, Freya could see the slight hesitation. in his movements that confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about adequate versus perfect anymore. This was about a ceremony that might go genuinely wrong, creating exactly the kind of dishonor that her grandfather had spent years training her to prevent. The first sign of trouble came when Sergeant Larsen reached for the flag's corner. His grip, which should have been firm and confident, appeared uncertain. Freya watched in growing alarm as he adjusted and readjusted his hold on the fabric, clearly struggling with the tremor that was making precise manipulation difficult. Around her, the congregation remained unaware of the developing crisis. They saw what they expected to see: uniformed soldiers conducting a military ceremony with appropriate dignity. They didn't have the trained eye to recognize the subtle signs that indicated this ceremony was about to become a disaster. But Freya saw everything. She saw Corporal Anderson's concerned glance toward his sergeant. She saw the way Corporal Haugen had positioned himself closer than usual, ready to compensate for potential problems. Most alarming, she saw the slight sag in the flag center where Sergeant Larsen's uncertain grip was creating tension that could lead to a catastrophic drop. Her grandmother, seated beside her in the front pew, watched the ceremony with trusting expectation. This was supposed to be the moment when her husband's 40 years of military service were honored with the precision and dignity he had earned. She had no way of knowing that the ceremony was on the verge of the kind of failure that would haunt everyone present for years to come. Freya's mind raced through the possibilities. If Sergeant Larsen's tremor caused him to drop the flag, it would touch the ground, the most serious breach of flag protocol possible. If his uncertain grip created wrinkles or tears in the fabric, the final presentation would be visibly flawed. If the other honor guard members had to intervene to prevent a disaster, the ceremony would become an awkward scramble rather than a dignified tribute. Any of these outcomes would be devastating for her grandmother, heartbreaking for the congregation, and a professional disaster for the honor guard members involved. But most importantly, it would be a failure to honor her grandfather's memory with the perfection he deserved and had taught her to achieve. The congregation remained blissfully unaware as Sergeant Larsen began the flag removal process. His movements were careful but visibly strained, each adjustment revealing the internal struggle between his dedication to duty and his physical limitations. Freya could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool chapel air. Time slowed as she watched the ceremony balanced on the edge of disaster. In her mind, she could hear her grandfather's voice from all those practice sessions. The flag knows when you respect it, Lil Ven. It responds to confidence and precision. But it will punish hesitation and uncertainty without mercy. Sergeant Larsen's hesitation was becoming more pronounced with each second. The flag, as if sensing the uncertainty in his grip, seemed to resist his movements. What should have been a smooth, flowing removal was becoming a careful struggle that threatened to become visible to the entire congregation. Freya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she faced the moment her grandfather had unknowingly prepared her for. Not just the opportunity to demonstrate her skills, but the necessity of preventing a disaster that would dishonor everything he had taught her about respect, precision, and the sacred nature of military ceremony. The crisis was no longer potential. It was unfolding in real time before her eyes. And she was the only person in the chapel who possessed both the ability to recognize what was happening and the skills to prevent it from becoming a tragedy that would haunt everyone present. What the adults around Freya didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was the extent of her dedication over the past 3 years. While her classmates spent afternoons playing video games or socializing, Freya had transformed her bedroom into a training ground that would have impressed military instructors. Hidden beneath her bed was a wooden chest that had belonged to her great-grandfather, filled with carefully organized materials that represented hundreds of hours of practice. 3 regulation-sized Norwegian flags in varying degrees of wear, each one retired from her grandfather's collection when it became too frayed for ceremonial use. A detailed notebook with hand-drawn diagrams showing every angle, every measurement, every timing sequence of the 13-fold process. But the real treasure was the collection of instructional materials her grandfather had accumulated over 4 decades of military service. Technical manuals from the Royal Norwegian Navy describing proper flag handling protocols. Photographs from military academies showing perfect triangular folds from multiple angles. Even video recordings of master ceremonies that her grandfather had obtained from various military archives. Freya had studied this material with the intensity of a doctoral student. She had memorized the precise dimensions of each fold, the first horizontal fold bringing the striped section over the blue field, the second horizontal fold creating the proper proportions for the subsequent triangular sequence. She knew that each triangular fold should create a perfect 45-degree angle, that the final triangle should measure exactly 15 centimeters on each side, that the blue field should be completely visible without any intrusion of stripes or white space. More importantly, she had practiced until these measurements became instinctive. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, while her mother assumed she was simply spending time with her grandfather, Freya was undergoing training that rivaled what professional honor guards received. Her grandfather had been merciless in his standards, correcting technique with the same precision he had once used to train naval recruits. Again, he would say when her fourth triangular fold created a slight irregularity. The flag knows when you're uncertain. Confidence creates precision. She would start over, sometimes repeating the entire sequence a dozen times until every movement flowed with unconscious competence. Her small hands, which adults assumed were a disadvantage, had actually become her greatest asset. She could manipulate the fabric with a delicacy that larger, stronger hands couldn't achieve. Her fingers could detect subtle variations in tension that might cause unwanted wrinkles. Her compact frame allowed her to position herself at optimal angles for each fold, creating sight lines that taller people struggled to maintain. Beyond the physical technique, her grandfather had taught her the historical significance of each element. She knew that the 13 folds represented the original American colonies, adapted to Norwegian tradition with modifications that honored their own military heritage. She understood that the triangular shape symbolized the tricorn hats worn by colonial soldiers, connecting present ceremonies to centuries of military tradition. This knowledge extended to related protocols that even experienced soldiers sometimes overlooked. She knew the proper way to approach a flag-draped casket from the foot end, never crossing the head of the deceased. She understood the timing of movements, the precise sequence that prevented the flag from ever touching the ground or becoming tangled during the folding process. She had memorized the words that should accompany the presentation, not just the standard phrases, but the deeper meaning that transformed routine ceremony into sacred ritual. Her preparation had been methodical and comprehensive. She had practiced in different weather conditions, understanding how humidity affected fabric behavior. She had trained with flags of varying weights and textures, learning to adjust her technique for different materials. She had even practiced blindfolded, developing the muscle memory that would allow her to maintain perfect form even under emotional stress. The most challenging aspect of her training had been maintaining the proper mindset. Her grandfather had insisted that technical perfection was meaningless without genuine reverence. The flag doesn't care about your skill, he had taught her. It responds to your respect. Every fold must carry the weight of what this symbol represents, the sacrifice of those who served, the gratitude of those who remember, the continuity of values that transcend individual lives. Freya had internalized this philosophy until flag folding became a form of meditation. Each practice session began with a moment of silence, acknowledging the significance of what she was about to do. Each fold was executed with deliberate intention, not just technical precision. The final presentation was performed with the solemnity appropriate, to handling something sacred. Now, sitting in the chapel surrounded by adults who saw her as a grieving child in need of comfort and protection, Freya carried within herself a level of expertise that most military personnel never achieved. Her grandfather had created not just a skilled student, but a master practitioner whose abilities transcended her age and size. The irony was profound. The person in this chapel most qualified to honor Captain Olsen's memory through perfect flag ceremony was the one person everyone would consider least qualified. The months of secret preparation, the hundreds of practice sessions, the deep understanding of military tradition, all of it hidden behind the assumption that children were observers, not participants, in the adult world of serious responsibility. In 20 minutes, she would face the choice that her grandfather had unknowingly prepared her for: accept the limitations others imposed, or step forward and demonstrate what true preparation could achieve. As Sergeant Larsen's struggle with the flag became more apparent, Freya felt a surge of desperate courage. She couldn't sit quietly and watch her grandfather's final ceremony become a disaster when she possessed the skills to prevent it. Taking a deep breath, she stood up from the front pew. "Excuse me," she said, her clear young voice cutting through the chapel's tense silence. "I can help with the flag ceremony." The effect was immediate and devastating. Heads turned throughout the congregation, expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. Her mother's hand shot out to grasp Freya's arm, trying to pull her back into the pew with a whispered, "Freya, no, sit down right now." Sergeant Larsen paused in his struggle with the flag, his face flushing red with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. "Young lady," he said in a strained voice, "this is a military ceremony. Please return to your seat." But Freya had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. "Sir, with respect, I can see that you're having difficulty. I've been trained in proper flag folding protocol. I can help ensure the ceremony honors my grandfather properly." The murmur that rippled through the congregation was like a wave of disapproval. Freya heard fragments of whispered outrage. "How dare she... quotes. A child interrupting... Complete disrespect." Her uncle Magnus rose from his seat, his military bearing rigid with indignation. "Freya Olsen," he said sharply, using her full name in the tone that adults reserved for serious misbehavior. "You will sit down immediately and apologize to Sergeant Larsen for this disruption. This is neither the time nor place for childish attention-seeking." The words hit like physical blows. Attention-seeking. Childish. As if her offer to help came from some desire to be noticed rather than from genuine concern for the ceremony's integrity. Freya felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she remained standing. "Uncle Magnus, I'm not seeking attention. I'm trying to prevent. You're trying to insert yourself into a solemn ceremony that requires training and experience you don't possess," interrupted Colonel Erikson, her father's business partner, who had risen from his seat with authority. "These men are professional soldiers who have conducted hundreds of flag ceremonies. The idea that a 12-year-old child could somehow improve upon their performance is not just inappropriate, it's insulting to their service." Corporal Anderson stepped forward, his voice carrying the patronizing patience that adults used when dealing with difficult children. "Miss, we appreciate your... enthusiasm, but flag ceremonies require physical strength and coordination that take years to develop. This flag weighs several kilograms when properly handled, and the folding sequence demands precision that comes only with extensive military training." "I have extensive training," Freya said, her voice growing stronger despite the overwhelming disapproval surrounding her. "My grandfather taught me proper protocol. I've practiced hundreds of times. I know I can." "Your grandfather played games with you," Sergeant Larsen interjected, his tremor making his voice shake slightly. "Military ceremonies aren't children's activities. The flag folding you've seen is simplified demonstration, not the real procedure we use for actual honors." The dismissal stung because it diminished not just her abilities, but her grandfather's teaching. As if Captain Henrik Olsen, with 40 years of military service, would have taught his granddaughter anything less than absolute precision. As if the man they were gathered to honor would have wasted time on simplified demonstrations, rather than passing down genuine expertise. Her grandmother leaned forward from the pew, her voice gentle but firm. "Kjaer, dear one, please sit down. I know you want to help, but this isn't how we show respect. Let these good men do their job." Even her own grandmother, the person who stood to receive the folded flag, couldn't conceive that Freya might actually possess the skills she claimed. The betrayal of that dismissal, gentle but absolute, nearly broke Freya's resolve. Pastor Johansson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue with the planned ceremony. Miss Olsen, I'm sure your grandfather would want you to show respect by allowing our military personnel to complete their duties." The weight of collective disapproval pressed down on Freya like a physical force. Every adult in the chapel, family members, military veterans, community leaders, religious authority, stood unified in their certainty that she was being inappropriate, disrespectful, childish. The message was clear and unanimous: sit down. Be quiet, and let the adults handle important matters. But even as the social pressure mounted, Freya could see that Sergeant Larsen's condition was worsening. The stress of the confrontation, combined with his physical difficulties, was making his tremor more pronounced. The flag in his hands was beginning to sag visibly, and Corporal Haugen had moved even closer, clearly preparing to intervene if the situation deteriorated further. "Sir," Freya said desperately, addressing Sergeant Larsen directly, "I can see you're struggling. There's no shame in accepting help when it ensures proper honor for my grandfather. Please just let me show you that I know what I'm doing." Sergeant Larsen's face hardened with wounded pride. "Young lady, I have been folding flags for longer than you have been alive. I will not be lectured by a child about military protocol, regardless of your family connection to the deceased." The finality in his voice, backed by the unanimous disapproval of every adult present, should have ended Freya's resistance. She was 12 years old, surrounded by people who cared about her welfare and genuinely believed they were protecting both her and the ceremony's dignity. But as she looked at her grandfather's flag, the symbol of a man who had taught her that excellence was its own justification, Freya realized that some moments demanded more than compliance with others' expectations. Freya stood at the crossroads between obedience and conscience, feeling the weight of every disapproving gaze in the chapel. Her mother's grip on her arm had tightened, silently demanding compliance. Her uncle Magnus stood rigid with military authority, expecting immediate surrender to his command. The entire congregation waited for her to apologize, sit down, and allow the ceremony to proceed as planned. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory from their last practice session, just 2 weeks before his unexpected heart attack. "There will come a time, Lilven, when you must choose between what others expect of you and what you know is right. In that moment, remember that true honor sometimes requires standing alone." She hadn't understood then what situation might demand such a choice. Now watching Sergeant Larsen's trembling hands threaten to dishonor the ceremony that meant everything to her family, the meaning became crystal clear. This wasn't about proving herself or gaining recognition. This was about preventing a tragedy that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The internal conflict raged within her 12-year-old mind. Every instinct of social conditioning screamed at her to obey, to trust the adults, to accept that her place was as an observer rather than a participant. These were good people who loved her, respected her grandfather, and genuinely believed they were protecting both the ceremony's dignity and her own well-being. But she could see what they couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. Sergeant Larsen's condition was deteriorating by the second. His face had grown pale with the stress of maintaining composure while fighting his body's betrayal. The flag in his hands was beginning to droop visibly, and even Corporal Haugen's nervous positioning couldn't hide the fact that disaster loomed moments away. Her grandmother's gentle plea echoed in her ears. Let these good men do their job. But what if their job was becoming impossible? What if kindness and tradition were about to collide with harsh physical reality? What if respecting their authority meant allowing them to fail in the most public and devastating way possible? Freya thought about the aftermath of such a failure. Her grandmother would receive a poorly folded flag, if one could be salvaged at all. The honor guard members would face professional embarrassment and personal anguish. The congregation would witness a ceremony that dishonored rather than celebrated her grandfather's memory. Everyone would suffer because she had chosen compliance over capability. The weight of her decision pressed down like the entire chapel's worth of judgment. She was 12 years old, surrounded by accomplished adults who had decades more experience in life, military service, and social protocols. Who was she to trust her own judgment over their collective wisdom? Who was she to believe that her secret preparation could matter more than their public authority? But then she remembered her grandfather's hands guiding hers through the 13th fold, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Precision is respect. Freya, when you handle this flag perfectly, you honor everyone who ever served under it. When you accept less than perfection, you dishonor their sacrifice. The choice crystallized with startling clarity. She could sit down, comply with expectations, and watch her grandfather's final ceremony become a failure that would forever taint his memory. Or she could trust in the training he had given her, accept the consequences of defying every adult in the room, and ensure that his flag received the honor he deserved. Her decision wasn't really about the flag ceremony at all. It was about whether she believed in the values her grandfather had taught her or would surrender them to social pressure. Whether she would honor his memory through perfect execution or betray it through comfortable compliance. Freya gently but firmly removed her mother's hand from her arm. She looked directly at Sergeant Larson, her young voice carrying new authority born of absolute certainty. Sir, my grandfather spent 3 years teaching me proper flag protocol because he believed this ceremony mattered more than anything else. I cannot sit quietly and watch his memory dishonored because everyone assumes a child can't possibly know what she's talking about. The chapel fell into stunned silence. Uncle Magnus's face reddened with indignation. Her mother gasped with horror. At such open defiance, Colonel Erikson shook his head with disgust at her persistence. But Freya had crossed the Rubicon of respectful compliance into the territory of principled rebellion. I'm going to help with this ceremony, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Not because I want attention or recognition, but because I'm the only person in this room who can ensure it's done properly. You can punish me afterward. You can lecture me about respect and obedience, but right now, my grandfather needs someone who won't fail him. She stepped forward toward the honor guard, her small form radiating determination that seemed impossible for someone her age. Behind her, the congregation erupted in whispered outrage, and family members began rising from their seats to physically restrain her, but Freya had made her choice. She would rather face punishment for trying than live with the knowledge that she had allowed failure when success was within her power. Her grandfather had taught her that some moments demanded everything you had regardless of the cost. This was that moment. As family members moved to restrain her and voices rose in the chapel, Freya did something that no one expected. She stepped not toward the honor guard, but around them, approaching her grandfather's casket from the foot end with the precise protocol her grandfather had drilled into her. The movement was so confident, so professionally executed, that it momentarily stunned the adults into silence. This wasn't the impulsive action of a rebellious child, but the deliberate approach of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Her positioning, her posture, even her pace reflected training that none of them had witnessed. Uncle Magnus lunged forward to stop her, but Corporal Haugen, acting on military instinct, stepped between them. "Sir, please maintain distance from the ceremony area," he said automatically, his training taking over even as confusion clouded his features. The brief interference gave Freya precious seconds. She reached the flag and without hesitation placed her hands in the exact position her grandfather had taught her. Her small fingers found the proper grip points instantly. Her stance adjusted to the optimal angle for the first fold. The trembling in Sergeant Larsen's hand seemed to calm as she shared the flag's weight, her steady confidence providing the stability he desperately needed. "What are you doing?" Sergeant Larsen whispered harshly, but his voice carried more uncertainty than authority. He could feel the difference in her touch, the absolute certainty, the precise control that his own hands could no longer provide. "I'm preventing this flag from touching the ground," Freya replied quietly, her voice carrying none of the defiance from moments earlier. Now she spoke with the focused calm of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. "Sir, please trust me for just 2 minutes. Let me show you what my grandfather taught me." Her positioning had been strategic. By approaching from the foot of the casket and taking a support role rather than attempting to push Sergeant Larsen aside, she had made herself difficult to remove without disrupting the ceremony entirely. Uncle Magnus and her father had moved closer, but they couldn't physically drag her away without risking damage to the flag or creating an even more disruptive scene. The first fold began before anyone could stop it. Freya's movements were fluid, precise, unconsciously perfect. Her small hands manipulated the heavy fabric with startling confidence, each adjustment creating the crisp lines that her grandfather had demanded. Sergeant Larsen, still gripping his corner of the flag, found himself following her lead despite his intentions. "This is outrageous," Colonel Erikson hissed from the congregation. "Someone stop that child before she ruins everything." But something remarkable was happening. The flag, which had been sagging and difficult to manage in Sergeant Larsen's uncertain grip, was now moving with the fluid grace of a perfect ceremony. Freya's technique was transforming what had been heading toward disaster into something approaching artistry. Corporal Anderson, positioned at the side of the casket, watched in growing amazement as Freya executed the second fold with textbook precision. Her grip never wavered, her timing was flawless, and most remarkably, she seemed to be guiding Sergeant Larsen through the motions with subtle pressure and positioning that helped compensate for his tremor. "How is she doing this?" Corporal Haugen murmured to his colleague, but neither had an answer. The chapel had fallen into tense silence as the impossibility of the situation unfolded before their eyes. They had expected chaos, embarrassment, disaster. Instead, they were witnessing the most technically perfect flag ceremony most of them had ever seen. Freya's movements carried a precision that seemed almost mechanical, yet somehow invested with profound reverence. Her grandfather's training revealed itself in every detail. She never allowed the flag to sag or create unwanted creases. Her positioning prevented it from touching any surface inappropriately. Most importantly, her complete confidence was steadying Sergeant Larsen's nerves, allowing him to contribute to the ceremony rather than struggling through it alone. "She actually knows what she's doing," someone whispered from the congregation, the comment carrying disbelief and growing respect. By the fourth fold, even Uncle Magnus had stopped trying to intervene. The ceremony had taken on a momentum that seemed dangerous to interrupt. Pastor Johansson watched with fascination rather than alarm, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening in his chapel. Freya's training showed in ways that only military personnel could fully appreciate. Her breathing remained steady despite the physical demands and emotional pressure. Her focus never wavered from the task at hand. Most remarkably, she seemed to anticipate each step in the sequence, moving with the kind of muscle memory that typically required years of professional experience. Sergeant Larsen, despite his initial resistance, was beginning to understand that this child possessed genuine expertise. Her support wasn't undermining his authority. It was preserving his dignity while ensuring the ceremony's success. The tremor in his hands had subsided as her confidence provided the stability he needed. "Just follow my lead, sir," Freya whispered, as they approached the more complex triangular folds. "Trust the training." The irony wasn't lost on the military personnel present. A 12-year-old girl was teaching an experienced sergeant to trust in training, demonstrating capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about age, experience, and military protocol. As they completed the 7th fold and moved into the final triangular sequence, it became clear that Freya wasn't just preventing disaster, she was creating something magnificent. The precision of her technique, the reverence in her movements, the absolute perfection of each fold was transforming a routine ceremony into a masterpiece of military tradition. The chapel watched in stunned silence as the impossible became reality. A child was conducting the most perfect flag ceremony any of them had ever witnessed. As Freya guided the ceremony into the triangular folding sequence, her true expertise became undeniable. Each fold revealed capabilities that transcended simple instruction or casual practice. Her fingers moved with the precision of a master craftsman, creating angles so perfect they seemed geometric in their accuracy. The 8th fold demonstrated her understanding of fabric tension dynamics. As she manipulated the heavy ceremonial flag, she adjusted her grip pressure in response to the material's behavior, compensating for factors that most trained personnel never learned to recognize. The flag responded to her touch as if it were an extension of her own body. "Impossible," Colonel Eriksen murmured from his seat, his military experience making him uniquely qualified to recognize what he was witnessing. Those hand positions, the timing. "She's using advanced techniques I've seen only in academy demonstrations." Sergeant Larson, still participating in the ceremony despite his initial resistance, felt the difference in every movement. Where his own actions had been uncertain and strained, Freya's guidance provided a framework of absolute confidence. She wasn't just folding a flag, she was orchestrating a performance that honored decades of military tradition. The 9th fold revealed her knowledge of historical protocol. As she created the triangular point, her positioning ensured that the blue field would emerge in perfect symmetry, without a single stripe or star visible inappropriately. This level of precision required understanding not just the mechanical process, but the symbolic significance of each element. Her grandmother, still seated in the front pew, watched with growing amazement. "Lars," she whispered to Freya's father. "She moves exactly like Henrik did. The same posture, the same confidence. How did she learn to do that?" The comparison to her grandfather was apt and profound. Freya had absorbed not just his techniques, but his entire approach to the ceremony. Her reverence for the flag, her understanding of its weight and significance, her absolute commitment to perfection. These weren't childish imitations, but genuine embodiment of military values out by the 10th fold. Even her harshest critics were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Uncle Magnus, his military bearing softened by growing respect, leaned forward to observe details that professional training had taught him to recognize. "Her grip strength is perfect," he murmured to Colonel Eriksen. "Too tight and you create wrinkles, too loose and you lose control. She's maintaining exactly the right pressure for that weight of fabric." The 11th fold demonstrated Freya's understanding of ceremonial timing. She moved with deliberate pace that honored the solemnity of the occasion while maintaining the precise rhythm that prevented awkward pauses or rushed transitions. Each movement flowed into the next with choreographed perfection. Corporal Anderson, positioned to observe from the side, noticed technical details that revealed the depth of her training. "Look at her foot positioning," he whispered to Corporal Haugen. "She's maintaining perfect balance distribution. That's advanced technique. They don't teach that until third-year military academy. The 12th fold brought gasps from the military personnel present. Freya executed a complex transition that required simultaneously managing multiple fabric tensions while maintaining perfect geometric precision. Her small hands worked with mechanical accuracy, creating crisp lines that seemed to define themselves. That's master-level technique, Sergeant Larson admitted quietly, his professional pride overcoming his initial resistance. I've seen career honor guard members struggle with that transition. How does a child know how to do that? But Freya's expertise extended beyond mere technical skill. As she approached the final fold, her entire demeanor reflected understanding of the ceremony's deeper meaning. This wasn't performance or showmanship, it was prayer made, manifest through perfect execution. The 13th and final fold completed the transformation of the ceremonial flag into a perfect triangle. Blue field emerged flawlessly, every star visible in proper alignment, not a single stripe intruding into the sacred space. The edges were mathematically precise, the fabric tension perfectly distributed. The overall result, a masterpiece of ceremonial art. The chapel fell into absolute silence as Freya lifted the completed flag triangle. Her movements as she turned toward her grandmother carried the same reverent precision that had characterized every fold. This was the moment of presentation, the culmination of the entire ceremony, and she executed it with grace that would have impressed master sergeants. "Ma'am," Freya said softly, approaching her grandmother with steps that seemed choreographed for their perfect dignity. "This flag is presented on behalf of a grateful nation in recognition of your husband's faithful and dedicated service." The words were traditional, but spoken with understanding that transformed them from rote recitation into genuine tribute. Her voice carried weight that seemed impossible for someone her age, reverence that honored both the flag and the man it had covered. As she placed the perfectly folded flag in her grandmother's hands, the geometric precision of her work was visible to everyone present. The triangle was flawless, edges straight, corners sharp, proportions exact. More than that, it radiated the kind of perfection that came only from complete mastery. Combined with genuine respect, her grandmother accepted the flag with trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Takk Kjær," she whispered in Norwegian. "Henrik would be so proud." The chapel remained silent as the full impact of what they had witnessed settled over the congregation. A 12-year-old girl had just conducted the most technically perfect, emotionally moving flag ceremony any of them had ever seen. Everything they thought they knew about age, capability, and respect had been challenged by 6 minutes of flawless execution. Freya stepped back from her grandmother, her duty complete, and for the first time since the ceremony began, allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had accomplished. She had honored her grandfather's memory with the perfection he had taught her to achieve. More than that, she had proven that dedication and skill transcended the artificial limitations others imposed. The silence stretched as 300 people struggled to process the impossible thing they had just witnessed. The silence in St. Erik's chapel was profound and transformative. 300 people sat in stunned recognition that they had just witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about capability, age, and respect. The perfect triangle of fabric in Grandmother Olsen's hands represented more than exceptional flag folding. It embodied the complete vindication of Freya's claims and the thorough demolition of every dismissive comment that had preceded it. Sergeant Larson stood beside Freya, his own hands now steady, his face reflecting a mixture of professional amazement and personal humility. The tremor that had threatened to destroy the ceremony had disappeared entirely, steadied by participation in something far greater than routine protocol. He looked down at the small girl who had transformed potential disaster into triumphant success. "In 32 years of military service," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the chapel's silence, I have never seen flag ceremony executed with such precision. Miss Olsen, your grandfather trained you well." The admission from a career military professional carried enormous weight. This wasn't polite recognition of childish effort, but genuine acknowledgement of mastery from someone qualified to make such judgments. His words began to shift the atmosphere from stunned silence toward growing recognition. Colonel Erikson rose slowly from his seat, his military bearing now reflecting respect rather than indignation. "Young lady," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. Your demonstration of skill and dedication has been extraordinary." The word hung in the air like a declaration. Extraordinary. Not good for her age or impressive considering, but extraordinary in absolute terms. The qualifier that had diminished Freya's abilities for years had finally been stripped away, leaving only recognition of genuine excellence. Uncle Magnus approached with steps that seemed heavy with the weight of his own assumptions. His military training had taught him to recognize superior performance when he witnessed it, and his conscience demanded acknowledgement of his earlier misjudgment. "Freya," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for addressing fellow military personnel, "your execution of that ceremony exceeded Academy standards. I was wrong to question your capabilities, and I was wrong to assume that age determines ability." The admission from her own family member, a retired colonel, who had dismissed her expertise just minutes earlier, represented a seismic shift in recognition. If Uncle Magnus could acknowledge her skills, then everything was possible. Pastor Johansson stepped forward from his position near the altar, his expression reflecting both spiritual and professional appreciation. "In 40 years of conducting military funerals," he said to the congregation, "I have witnessed many flag ceremonies. What we have just seen represents the highest form of respect and honor. Technique so perfect it becomes prayer. Dedication so complete it transforms ceremony into sacred art." His words elevated Freya's achievement beyond technical competence into the realm of spiritual tribute. The flag folding hadn't just been executed correctly, it had been performed with reverence that honored both military tradition and divine purpose. From throughout the chapel, murmurs of recognition began to build. Military veterans who understood the technical demands of perfect flag ceremony spoke in amazed whispers about details only trained eyes could appreciate. Civilian attendees who had initially been scandalized by Freya's intervention now realized they had witnessed something remarkable. "Did you see how she controlled the fabric tension during the triangular sequence?" whispered one retired naval officer to his neighbor. "That requires understanding of advanced physics principles. I've seen Academy instructors struggle with those transitions." Her own family members began to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Her father, still struggling to reconcile his 12-year-old daughter with the master craftsman he had just observed, approached with wonderment, replacing his earlier alarm. "Freya," he said softly, "I had no idea. Your grandfather never told us you had learned so much." The realization was spreading through the congregation like ripples in still water. This hadn't been rebellious disruption or attention-seeking behavior. This had been a granddaughter ensuring that her grandfather received the honor he deserved. Executed with skills that surpassed professional military standards, her grandmother stood slowly, the perfectly folded flag cradled in her arms, and approached Freya with steps made careful by age and emotion. When she reached her granddaughter, she bent down to embrace her, whispering words that carried across the silent chapel. "Henrik always said you were special, Lil Van. Now I understand what he meant. You didn't just learn his techniques, you inherited his heart." The embrace between grandmother and granddaughter, witnessed by a chapel full of people who had doubted and then been amazed, represented the completion of something profound. Freya had not only honored her grandfather's memory through perfect ceremony, but had vindicated his faith in her abilities against every voice that had dismissed them. As they separated, Grandmother Olsen turned to address the congregation. her voice carrying the authority of widow, family matriarch, and witness to extraordinary dedication. "My husband spent 3 years teaching our granddaughter because he recognized something the rest of us missed," she said clearly. "He saw that true respect has nothing to do with age or size or what others expect. He saw that some people are born to honor traditions with perfection, regardless of what the world tells them they cannot do." The chapel erupted in spontaneous applause, not the polite recognition typically offered at funerals, but genuine celebration of excellence witnessed and respect earned. The sound filled the sacred space like a thunderous validation of everything Freya had fought to prove. Standing in the center of it all, still wearing her too short black dress and uncomfortable shoes, Freya felt the transformation that her grandfather had promised would come. She was no longer the child who was dismissed and overlooked. She was the person who had proven that dedication and skill could overcome any limitation others tried to impose. The critical success moment was complete. Everything had changed. As the applause gradually subsided, the full implications of what had transpired began to settle over the chapel like morning fog revealing a transformed landscape. The spontaneous celebration gave way to a more complex reckoning as military protocol and institutional authority confronted the reality of what a 12-year-old civilian had just accomplished. Major Torstein Haugen, the commanding officer of the Bergen Military Honor Guard, rose from his seat near the back of the chapel. His presence had gone unnoticed during the ceremony, but now his uniform and bearing commanded attention as he approached the front of the church. His expression was unreadable, carrying the weight of someone who must address a situation that had no precedent in military procedure. "Sergeant Larsen," Major Haugen said formally, his voice cutting through the residual murmur of conversation. "Report." The command hung in the air with official gravity. Sergeant Larsen straightened to attention, his earlier tremor replaced by military precision, though his face reflected the complexity of explaining the inexplicable. "Sir," Larsen began carefully, "due to a temporary medical condition, I experienced difficulty maintaining proper flag handling protocol. Miss Olsen provided assistance that ensured the ceremony was completed to the highest military standards." The clinical language couldn't disguise the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. A civilian child had intervened in a military ceremony, and not only prevented disaster but exceeded professional expectations. Major Haugen's training provided no framework for such a situation. "Miss Olsen," the major said, turning his attention to Freya with the formal tone reserved for addressing fellow military personnel, "your actions today violated several protocols regarding civilian participation in military ceremonies. You acted without authorization, disregarded direct orders from supervising personnel, and inserted yourself into official proceedings." The words carried the weight of potential consequences that could extend far beyond the chapel. Military protocols existed for reasons of safety, dignity, and chain of command. Freya's intervention, regardless of its success, represented a breach that demanded official response. But Major Haugen's expression shifted as he continued. Professional obligation warring with recognition of extraordinary circumstances. "However," he said, his tone moderating slightly, "your demonstration of technical skill and ceremonial knowledge was exceptional. Your intervention prevented what could have been a significant dishonor to Captain Olsen's memory and maintained the dignity of military tradition." The qualification hung between condemnation and commendation, reflecting the impossible position that Freya's actions had created. She had broken rules to uphold higher principles, violated protocol to preserve honor, acted without authority to prevent failure. Uncle Magnus stepped forward, his retired colonel's insignia giving him standing to address the situation. "Major Haugen, if I may," he said formally, "this young woman demonstrated capabilities that suggest training far beyond civilian parameters. Perhaps we should understand how she acquired such skills before determining appropriate response." The Suggestion opened space for explanation rather than immediate judgment. Major Haugen nodded, recognizing the wisdom of gathering information before making decisions that would affect both military reputation and family relationships. "Miss Olsen," he said to Freya, "can you explain how you acquired the training demonstrated today?" Freya straightened her shoulders, drawing upon the confidence that her perfect ceremony had validated. "Sir, my grandfather, Captain Henrik Olsen, provided comprehensive instruction in proper flag handling protocol over a 3-year period. His training covered historical significance, technical precision, and ceremonial reverence. He believed that respect for military tradition should be maintained to the highest possible standards." Her answer was direct, professional, and carried implicit criticism of the assumption that such training was inappropriate for civilians. She wasn't apologizing for her knowledge or her intervention. She was explaining the foundation that made both possible. Major Haugen exchanged glances with Sergeant Larsen, both men recognizing the implications of her statement. Captain Olsen's reputation for precision and dedication was legendary within Norwegian military circles. If he had indeed provided comprehensive training to his granddaughter, her capabilities would reflect his standards rather than civilian approximations. "Captain Olsen trained many personnel during his service," Major Haugen acknowledged. "His standards were notoriously demanding. Are you saying he applied those same standards to your instruction?" "Yes, sir," Freya replied without hesitation. "He said that respect admits no compromise. Either you honor traditions properly or you dishonor them completely. There was no middle ground in his teaching." The statement carried the ring of authentic military philosophy. Officers throughout the chapel nodded recognition of principles they had lived by throughout their careers. Freya wasn't just claiming training, she was articulating values that define military service. Colonel Erikson approached the growing circle of discussion, his earlier antagonism replaced by professional curiosity. "Major, if Captain Olsen indeed provided comprehensive training, then Miss Olsen's intervention might be viewed differently. She wasn't acting as unauthorized civilian, but as trained personnel responding to emergency circumstances." The reframing was significant and deliberate. Rather than rebellious child disrupting ceremony, Freya became trained responder preventing disaster. The lens through which her actions were viewed would determine everything that followed, but questions remained that demanded answers, and Major Haugen's expression reflected the complexity of balancing military discipline with exceptional circumstances. Major Haugen stepped closer to examine the folded flag still cradled in Grandmother Olsen's arms, his trained eye assessing details that would determine his official response. What he saw there would either validate or condemn everything that had transpired in the preceding minutes. The triangle was geometrically perfect, each edge aligned with mathematical precision, creating angles that seemed to define themselves through their absolute accuracy. The blue field displayed every star in proper alignment, unmarred by intrusion from stripes or white space. Most remarkably, the fabric tension was distributed so evenly that the flag seemed to hold its shape through internal harmony rather than external pressure. "Sergeant Larsen," Major Haugen said quietly, "in your professional assessment, how would you rate the technical execution of this ceremony?" Larsen's response carried the weight of career experience and professional integrity. "Sir, this represents the highest standard of flag ceremony I have witnessed in 3 decades of service. The precision exceeds academy demonstration quality. Every technical requirement was not just met but perfected." The admission from a senior non-commissioned officer carried enormous significance. This wasn't charitable recognition of civilian effort, but professional acknowledgement of superior performance from someone qualified to make such distinctions. Corporal Anderson stepped forward, adding his own assessment. "Sir, Miss Olsen's knowledge of advanced techniques was remarkable. She demonstrated understanding of fabric dynamics, ceremonial timing, and historical protocol that surpasses what most military personnel achieve, even with extensive training. Major Haugen turned to address the wider congregation, his voice carrying formal authority, but also growing recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, what we witnessed today was not civilian interference in military ceremony, but the demonstration of skills that honor our highest traditions. Miss Olsen's intervention prevented dishonor and ensured that Captain Olsen received the tribute his service deserved. The official validation from commanding authority transformed the entire narrative. Freya's actions were no longer viewed as inappropriate disruption, but as necessary intervention that preserved military honor. The shift in perspective was immediate and profound. Pastor Johansson approached the group, carrying a leather-bound book that Freya recognized as her grandfather's personal journal. Major Haugen, I believe this may provide additional context, he said, opening to pages marked with careful bookmarks. The pastor read aloud in his clear voice. Training log. Freya Olsen, session 127. Today she achieved perfect 13-fold sequence in under 3 minutes. Her precision now exceeds that of many professional honor guard members I have observed. She understands that this training is not game or hobby, but preparation for sacred responsibility. Should circumstances ever require it, she is ready to honor military tradition with perfection it demands. The journal entry, dated just 1 month before Captain Olsen's death, revealed the depth and seriousness of Freya's training. This hadn't been casual instruction or grandfather's indulgence, but systematic preparation for exactly the kind of situation that had developed today. Major Haugen closed the journal thoughtfully, his expression reflecting new understanding. Captain Olsen was preparing his granddaughter to serve as guardian of military tradition, he said slowly. His training wasn't recreational, it was purposeful preparation for preserving honor when circumstances demanded it. The realization rippled through the military personnel present. Freya hadn't stumbled into expertise through childhood curiosity, but had been deliberately trained by a master practitioner who recognized potential that others overlooked. Her intervention today represented fulfillment of her grandfather's intentions rather than violation of military protocol. Colonel Erikson addressed the congregation with the authority of senior rank and long experience. What we have witnessed challenges our assumptions about age, capability, and the nature of military service. This young woman demonstrated that dedication and skill transcend artificial limitations we place on human potential. His words carried weight that extended beyond the immediate situation. The implications reached into every assumption about who could serve, who deserved opportunity, who should be taken seriously when they claimed capabilities others couldn't imagine. Uncle Magnus stepped forward, his earlier antagonism replaced by profound respect. Freya, he said formally, I owe you more than apology. I owe you recognition. Your performance today honored not just your grandfather's memory, but the finest traditions of Norwegian military service. The acknowledgement from family authority figures completed the transformation of official perspective. Every voice that had dismissed her capabilities now spoke in validation of her extraordinary achievement, but the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. An elderly man in the back row stood slowly, his movement drawing attention throughout the chapel. The insignia on his civilian jacket identified him as General Erikson, former Chief of Staff of the Norwegian Armed Forces, a man whose presence commanded absolute respect. In 60 years of military service, General Erikson said, his voice carrying across the silent chapel, I have learned that true military virtue appears in many forms. Today, we witness the highest form, complete dedication to honor, regardless of personal cost or social pressure. Miss Olsen exemplified everything we hope to achieve in military service. The endorsement from the highest military authority present sealed Freya's vindication completely. No higher validation was possible, no greater recognition could be achieved. The results of her intervention spoke with undeniable clarity. She had preserved honor, demonstrated excellence, and proven that capability transcended every limitation others had tried to impose. The chapel remained silent as the full magnitude of her achievement settled into collective consciousness. A 12-year-old girl had not only saved a military ceremony from disaster, but had redefined what was possible when preparation met opportunity and courage overcame convention. The results spoke louder than any argument, carried more weight than any authority, and proved more convincingly than any demonstration that excellence belonged to those who earned it, regardless of age, size, or others' expectations. 6 months later, Freya stood in the main hall of the Royal Norwegian Naval Academy, wearing a crisp dress uniform specially tailored for her small frame. The insignia on her collar identified her as Honorary Instructor of Ceremonial Protocol, a position created specifically to recognize her unique expertise and contributions to military tradition. The transformation in her life had been swift and comprehensive. The viral video of her flag ceremony, recorded by a funeral attendee and shared across social media, had sparked international conversation about talent, age prejudice, and the nature of respect. Military academies from 3 countries had requested demonstrations of her techniques. Her story had been featured in newspapers, military journals, and educational programs worldwide. But more importantly, her example had created ripple effects that extended far beyond personal recognition. The Norwegian military had revised its protocols to allow qualified civilians to assist in emergency ceremonial situations. Military schools had begun incorporating her grandfather's training methods into their curricula. Most significantly, age restrictions on ceremonial participation had been reconsidered across multiple institutions. Today, she stood before an audience of military cadets, preparing to conduct the training session that had become her specialty. These young adults, some nearly twice her age, listened with respectful attention as she explained the principles that transformed routine procedure into sacred art. "Precision is respect," she told them, echoing her grandfather's words with authority, "earned through perfect demonstration. When you handle military symbols, you carry the honor of everyone who served before you. Excellence isn't optional, it's mandatory." Her students nodded with understanding that transcended her age. They had seen the videos, studied her techniques, and recognized mastery regardless of its source. The prejudice that had once dismissed her capabilities seemed impossible in the face of undeniable excellence. Among the cadets sat several young people, whose own paths had been changed by Freya's example. Maria Anderson, age 14, had been accepted into advanced military preparation programs after demonstrating exceptional tactical knowledge. Erik, only 13, had been granted permission to participate in honor guard training based on his documented precision skills. Throughout Norway and beyond, young people who had been told they were too young or not ready were finding doors opening that had previously remained closed. The Academy's commandant, General Larsen, introduced each training session with words that had become institutional tradition. "Excellence recognizes no artificial limitations. Age, size, background, and others' expectations cannot diminish genuine capability." Miss Olsen's example reminds us that military virtue appears in many forms, often from unexpected sources. After each training session, Freya returned to her modified schedule that balanced education with her ceremonial duties. She still attended regular school, still lived with her family in Bergen, still dealt with homework and teenage social dynamics. But her afternoons were spent in military facilities, teaching precision to professional soldiers and demonstrating that expertise belonged to those who earned it. Her relationship with her family had been forever changed by that day in St. Erik's Chapel. Uncle Magnus now consulted her on ceremonial questions, treating her opinions with the respect due to acknowledged expertise. Her parents had come to understand that their daughter possessed not just unusual skills, but genuine calling to preserve military tradition through perfect execution. Most meaningfully, her grandmother had framed the perfectly folded flag from the funeral, displaying it in the place of honor above the mantelpiece where Captain Olsen's medals and commendations had always hung. "Henrik always said you were destined for something special," she often told visitors. "Now I understand he was preparing you to carry forward what he valued most." The broader impact of Freya's story continued to unfold in ways both dramatic and subtle. Military academies reported increased applications from younger candidates who had been inspired by her example. Ceremonial units noted improved performance standards as personnel strived to match the precision she had demonstrated. Most importantly, institutions across multiple countries had begun questioning age-based assumptions that limited participation in meaningful activities, but perhaps the most significant change was in the countless young people who had heard her story and found courage to pursue their own exceptional capabilities despite others' skepticism. Letters arrived weekly from children and teenagers who had been told they were too young for various pursuits, music, academics, athletics, leadership roles, who drew inspiration from her example to persist despite dismissal. "Your story taught me that being ready isn't about age," wrote one 12-year-old from Sweden who had successfully auditioned for a national youth orchestra, despite being told she lacked sufficient experience. "It's about preparation meeting opportunity when you have courage to step forward." As Freya concluded another training session and prepared to return home, she paused in the Academy's Memorial Hall, where photographs of distinguished graduates covered the walls. Among those honored alumni hung a new addition, a portrait of Captain Henrik Olsen, with a small plaque beneath that read, "In recognition of exceptional service and dedication to training the next generation of military professionals." Standing before her grandfather's photograph, Freya reflected on the journey from dismissed child to recognized expert, from overlooked granddaughter to honored instructor. The path had required courage, preparation, and willingness to stand alone when everyone else doubted her capabilities. But most importantly, it had required faith in her grandfather's fundamental teaching, that excellence belonged to those who pursued it with complete dedication, regardless of what others believed possible. That respect for tradition demanded nothing less than perfect execution, no matter the source of that perfection. As she walked toward the academy entrance, past cadets who nodded respectfully to someone whose age was irrelevant compared to her proven abilities, Freya carried forward the legacy her grandfather had entrusted to her. She had become not just the guardian of military ceremonial tradition, but living proof that limitations existed only until someone possessed the skill and courage to transcend them. The girl who had once been told she was too small, too young, too inexperienced to matter had proven that when preparation meets opportunity and courage overcomes convention, anything becomes possible. Her grandfather's flag ceremony had been perfect, but her true achievement was showing the world that perfection belonged to those bold enough to claim it, one impossible moment at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.